The moving truck pulled away from the curb on a cold Tuesday morning in February, stood on the sidewalk with her mother, watching everything they owned disappear down the street toward a city they had never been to before. Behind them was a small apartment building with peeling paint and a broken buzzer. This was their new home now. 3 weeks ago, life had been completely different. They had lived in a quiet town in Ohio where everyone knew everyone. Her father had worked at the local factory for 15 years. They weren't rich, but they were comfortable. They had a little house with a backyard, had friends she had known since kindergarten. Life was simple and predictable. Then the factory closed down, just like that. One Friday afternoon, her father came home with a box of his belongings and a look on his face that had never seen before. Within 2 weeks, they learned that finding work in their small town was nearly impossible. Her father searched everywhere. He applied to dozens of jobs. Nothing came through. That's when her uncle called from the city. He knew someone who was hearing. It wasn't a great job, but it was something. The catch was they had to move immediately. And so, in the middle of her junior year of high school, found herself standing in front of a run-down apartment building, watching her old life drive away in the back of a rented truck. Her mother put a hand on her shoulder. "It's only temporary," she said softly. "Once your father gets settled, things will get better." Nodded, but she didn't really believe it. She had heard those words before. Adults always said things would get better. Sometimes they did. Most times they just got different. The apartment was small. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that was also the living room. The walls were thin and could hear the neighbors arguing about something through the ceiling. The radiator made a clanking sound every few minutes. But in the corner of the main room, pushed against the wall like it had always belonged there, was her grandmother's piano. It was an old upright, nothing fancy. The wood was scratched in places, and 2 of the keys stuck if you didn't press them just right. But 2, it was the most beautiful thing in the world. Her grandmother had brought it with her when she came to America decades ago. It had traveled across oceans and through countless moves, and now it sat in this tiny apartment, a reminder of everything had lost and everything she still had. Her grandmother lived with them now too. She was 78 years old, with silver hair and hands that shook slightly when she poured her tea. But when she sat at that piano, something changed. Her back would straighten, her eyes would sharpen, and her fingers would move across the keys like water flowing over stones. She had been a concert pianist once, back in Shanghai, before the world changed and she had to leave everything behind. She never talked about those days much, but she had made sure that learned to play. From the time was 4 years old, her grandmother had sat beside her on that piano bench, guiding her small fingers across the keys. They couldn't afford proper lessons. There was no money for music camps or competitions or fancy teachers, but's grandmother didn't believe in any of that anyway. "Music is not about certificates," she would say. "Music is about what you feel. Anyone can learn to press keys. Very few can learn to speak through them." And so had learned, not in a classroom or a studio, but in living rooms and kitchens, wherever that old piano happened to be. She practiced every night until her fingers ached. She learned pieces that most students her age wouldn't attempt for years. And she did it all in secret, because in her old town, being good at piano wasn't something that made you popular. It made you weird. Now in this new city, figured it wouldn't matter anyway. She didn't plan on telling anyone about the piano. She didn't plan on telling anyone anything. Her goal was simple: keep her head down, get through the rest of high school, don't make waves. That plan lasted about 3 days. Her new school was called Westbrook Academy. It was a private school, the kind with brick buildings and Latin phrases carved above the doorways. Most of the students came from wealthy families. Their parents were lawyers and doctors and executives. They drove expensive cars and wore clothes that cost more than his entire wardrobe. Was only able to attend because of a special scholarship program for families facing financial hardship. The school got to brag about diversity. got a free education. It was supposed to be a win for everyone. It didn't feel like winning. From the moment she walked through those front doors, felt like she had a sign on her forehead that said, "Doesn't belong here." Her backpack was from a discount store. Her shoes were 2 years old. She didn't know the right words to say or the right way to act. Everything about her screamed outsider. The other students weren't cruel exactly. They were just indifferent. They looked through her like she wasn't there. In some ways, that was worse than bullying. At least if someone pushed you, they acknowledged you existed. Ate lunch alone. She sat in the back of every class. She spoke only when teachers called on her, and even then she kept her answers short. She learned the hallways and the schedules and the unwritten rules of the school. She learned which bathrooms were safe to use and which stairwells to avoid. She became a ghost. Then came the day that changed everything. It started with a scheduling error. Had been assigned to general music, a basic class for students who needed an arts credit but had no real interest in music. But when she showed up on her first day, the teacher looked confused. Apparently, there had been a mix-up with her transfer paperwork. Her old school had listed her as having advanced musical experience based on some form her grandmother had filled out years ago. "You're supposed to be in music appreciation," the teacher said, checking his computer screen. "Room 214, Mrs. Class." Stomach dropped. She had heard about Mrs. Everyone had heard about Mrs. She was a former concert pianist who had performed in Europe and Asia before an injury ended her career. Now she taught at Westbrook, but only the elite students. Her class was for kids who had been playing instruments since before they could walk, kids with private tutors and summer programs at prestigious academies. "I think there's been a mistake," said quietly. "I should probably stay in general music." The teacher shrugged. "The computer says what it says. Take it up with Mrs. if you want to switch." Considered arguing. She considered going to the main office and explaining the situation, but something stopped her. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe, deep down, some small part of her wanted to see what this class was all about. She picked up her bag and headed for room 214. The classroom was smaller than she expected. There were only about 15 students, arranged in a semicircle around a beautiful grand piano that sat at the front of the room. The walls were covered with portraits of famous composers and framed concert programs. Everything about the space said, "Serious musicians only." And at the center of it all, standing beside the piano with her arms crossed, was Mrs. She was tall and thin, with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. She wore a black dress and simple pearl earrings. Her posture was perfect, like a dancer or a soldier, and her eyes were cold. Those eyes landed on the moment she walked through the door. "You must be the transfer student," Mrs. said. It wasn't a question. Nodded. Mrs. looked her up and down slowly. Her gaze paused on her worn backpack, her simple clothes, her scuffed shoes. Something flickered across her face. It wasn't quite disgust. It was more like disappointment, like she had already decided exactly who was and found her lacking. "Find a seat," Mrs. said finally, turning back to the piano. "Try to keep up." Walked to an empty chair in the back corner. As she sat down, she could feel the other students watching her. Some looked curious. Most looked amused. A few exchanged glances that clearly said the same thing. "This girl is not going to last." Pulled out a notebook and pretended to study her schedule. Her heart was pounding. Her hands were sweating. Every instinct told her to run, to go back to the office, to beg for a transfer to any other class. But she didn't move. She stayed in that chair in that room, with those eyes on her. And she had no idea that this moment would change her life forever. The first week in Mrs. Class was uncomfortable. The second week was worse. By the third week, understood exactly what was happening. She had become a target. It started small. Little comments here and there that seemed innocent on the surface, but carried a sharp edge underneath. Mrs. would ask a question about some obscure composer from the 18th century, and before anyone else could answer, her eyes would find in the back corner. "Perhaps our new student can enlighten us," she would say, her voice smooth as silk. "Surely you covered this at your previous school." Never knew the answers. How could she? Her old school didn't have music appreciation classes. They barely had a music program at all. The questions Mrs. asked weren't normal classroom questions. They were traps designed to expose what didn't know. And every time stumbled, every time she had to admit she didn't have an answer, Mrs. would let out this little sigh. It was barely audible, but everyone heard it. Then she would turn to one of her favorite students and say something like, "Perhaps someone with proper training can help us." The other students caught on quickly. Some of them started smirking whenever Mrs. called on. A few would whisper to each other and laugh quietly. One girl in the front row, the daughter of some important businessman, would roll her eyes dramatically every time spoke. Nobody stood up for her. Nobody told Mrs. to stop. In a school like Westbrook, the teachers were almost as powerful as the wealthy parents who funded everything. And Mrs. had been there for over 20 years. She was untouchable. Thought about switching out of the class. She even went to the guidance counselor's office one afternoon and stood outside the door for 10 minutes. But something held her back. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was stubbornness. Or maybe it was something her grandmother had told her years ago when had wanted to quit piano because the other kids made fun of her. "Running away is easy," her grandmother had said. "Anyone can run, but staying when everything tells you to leave, that takes real strength." So stayed. She sat in that back corner every day and endured whatever Mrs. threw at her. She stopped raising her hand. She stopped making eye contact. She became invisible in that classroom, just another piece of furniture that didn't belong. But the worst part wasn't the humiliation. The worst part was that Mrs. never once asked her to play. Every week, students would perform for the class. They would sit at that beautiful grand piano and play pieces they had been practicing with their private tutors. Some were genuinely talented. Others were mediocre but confident. Mrs. would critique each performance, offering praise to her favorites and gentle corrections to everyone else. But she never called on, not once. It was like she had already decided that had nothing to offer. Like asking her to play would be a waste of everyone's time. And somehow, that hurt more than all the embarrassing questions combined. At home, things were different. Every night after dinner, after her parents had gone to bed and the apartment fell quiet, would sit at her grandmother's piano. The old woman would settle into her chair nearby, a cup of tea in her shaking hands, and listen. "Play the Chopin tonight," her grandmother would say. Or "Let's work on your left hand is getting lazy." And would play. She would play until her fingers burned and her shoulders ached. She would play the same passage over and over until it was perfect. Her grandmother was not an easy teacher. She demanded excellence. She noticed every missed note, every rushed tempo, every moment where some emotions didn't match the music. "You're playing the notes," her grandmother would say, shaking her head. "But you're not playing the music. There's a difference. The notes are just instructions. The music is what lives between them." Didn't always understand what her grandmother meant, but she kept trying. Night after night, year after year, she had kept trying. And somewhere along the way, something had clicked. The piano had become more than an instrument to her. It had become a voice, a way to say all the things she couldn't put into words. But nobody at school knew any of this. To them was just the quiet scholarship girl who didn't belong in the advanced music class. The girl who couldn't answer simple questions about Baroque composers. The girl Mrs. loved to embarrass. One afternoon in early March, Mrs. was in a particularly sharp mood. She had been talking about a famous pianist who had performed at Carnegie Hall, and somehow the conversation turned to natural talent versus hard work. "Some people are born with a gift," Mrs. said, packing in front of the piano. "You can see it immediately. The way they hold themselves, the way they approach the instrument, it's in their blood. She paused and looked around the room, her gaze settled on. And then there are people who simply don't have it. No amount of practice, no amount of lessons will ever change that. Music requires something that cannot be taught. Either you have it or you don't. The room was silent. Everyone knew who she was talking about. Felt her face grow hot, her hands clenched under her desk. For a moment, she wanted to stand up and say something. She wanted to walk to that piano and show Mrs. exactly what she could do. She wanted to play something so beautiful and so complex that it would wipe that smug expression right off her teacher's face. But she didn't. She sat there, frozen, while Mrs. continued her lecture about natural talent and proper breeding. She sat there while the other students glanced at her with pity or amusement. She sat there and swallowed the anger that burned in her chest like fire. That night came home and went straight to the piano. She didn't even take off her coat. She just sat down and started playing. Not a structured piece, not something her grandmother had assigned. Just sound. Raw, angry sound that poured out of her like water breaking through a dam. Her grandmother appeared in the doorway and watched silently. When finally stopped, her hands were trembling. There were tears on her cheeks that she didn't remember crying. "Tell me," her grandmother said quietly, and told her everything. About Mrs., about the questions she couldn't answer, about the looks and the whispers and the feeling that she would never be good enough, no matter how hard she tried. She told her grandmother about feeling invisible and worthless and so incredibly alone. Her grandmother listened without interrupting. When finished, the old woman was quiet for a long moment. "This teacher," she finally said, "she thinks she knows you." Nodded miserably. "She's wrong." Looked up. Her grandmother's eyes were sharp, brighter than had seen them in months. She sees a poor girl with no formal training. She sees someone who doesn't fit into her perfect little world. But she doesn't see you. She doesn't see what you can do. "It doesn't matter what I can do," said bitterly. "She'll never give me a chance to show it." Her grandmother smiled. It was a strange smile, almost mysterious. "The chance will come," she said. "It always does. The question is whether you'll be ready when it arrives." She reached out and took hands in her own. Her fingers were thin and fragile, but her grip was surprisingly strong. "Promise me something," her grandmother said. "Promise me that when that moment comes, you won't run. You won't hide. You will sit at that piano and show them exactly who you are." Looked into her grandmother's eyes. She saw decades of struggle there, years of sacrifice and loss and fighting against a world that had tried to silence her. And she saw something else too. Faith. Absolute, unshakable faith. "I promise," whispered. Her grandmother nodded and released her hands. "Good. Now play the Chopin again, from the beginning, and this time play it like you mean it." Turned back to the piano, she took a deep breath, and she began to play. Outside, the city hummed with noise and traffic, and a million lives being lived. But inside that tiny apartment, there was only the music, only the piano, only a girl and her grandmother and a promise that hung in the air like a held breath. The chance would come. Just had to be ready. Spring came early that year. The snow melted. The trees started to bud, and posters began appearing all over Westbrook Academy advertising the annual spring showcase. Had heard about the showcase from other students. It was the biggest event of the year, even bigger than homecoming or graduation. Wealthy donors attended. Parents flew in from around the country. College scouts came looking for the next generation of musical talent. Performing at the spring showcase could open doors that would otherwise stay locked forever. Of course, not everyone got to perform. Mrs. personally selected which students would take the stage. It was considered an incredible honor, a stamp of approval that carried weight far beyond the school walls. Students who were chosen often went on to attend prestigious conservatories and universities. Students who weren't chosen simply didn't exist in the eyes of the music world. Never expected to be part of it. She was still invisible in that class, still sitting in her corner, still enduring Mrs. Pointed questions and disappointed sighs. The showcase was for the real musicians, the ones with pedigrees and private tutors, not for girls from tiny Ohio towns who learned piano from their grandmothers. So when Mrs. made her announcement that Tuesday afternoon, didn't even look up from her notebook. "As you all know," Mrs. began, standing beside the grand piano with her hands clasped in front of her, "the spring showcase is 1 week away. I have selected this year's performers, and I'm pleased to say that Westbrook will be well represented." She read off a list of names, the usual suspects: the girl whose father donated a new wing to the library, the boy whose mother was on the board of directors, the students Mrs. had been grooming since freshman year. Each name was met with polite applause. Then Mrs. paused. A small smile crossed her face, and something about it made stomach tighten. "This year," Mrs. continued, "I've decided to do something a little different. I believe in giving every student an opportunity to grow, even those who may be less prepared than others." Her eyes swept across the room and landed directly on. "Our transfer student will be performing at the showcase." The room went silent. His head snapped up. She must have misheard. There was no way Mrs. had just said what she thought she said. But the teacher was looking right at her, that thin smile still on her lips. "Consider it a learning experience," Mrs. said. "Sometimes the best lessons come from stepping outside our comfort zone. I'm sure our guest will rise to the occasion." Someone in the front row snickered, then another student. Soon whispers were buzzing around the room like flies. Could feel their eyes on her, could practically hear what they were thinking. "This is going to be a disaster. She's going to humiliate herself. This is going to be hilarious." Sat frozen in her chair, her heart pounding so loud she was sure everyone could hear it. Her face felt hot. Her hands were cold. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor, to be anywhere but in that room at that moment. Mrs. had finally found the perfect way to destroy her, not with questions she couldn't answer or looks she couldn't ignore. No, this was much worse. This was public execution disguised as opportunity. Would stand on that stage in front of hundreds of people and prove once and for all that she didn't belong. And there was nothing she could do about it. The rest of the class passed in a blur. Didn't hear a single word. When the bell finally rang, she grabbed her bag and rushed out before anyone could say anything to her. She walked through the halls with her head down, pushed through the front doors, and didn't stop until she was 3 blocks away from the school. Then she sat down on a bench and cried. She cried for everything, for the unfairness of it all, for the months of humiliation she had endured, for her family's struggles and their tiny apartment and her father working a job he hated just to keep them afloat. She cried because she was tired of being strong, tired of pretending things were okay when they clearly weren't. When she finally made it home, her grandmother was waiting. The old woman was sitting at the kitchen table with her tea, but her eyes were sharp and alert. She took one look at his face and knew something had happened. "Sit," she said simply. "Sit. Tell me." So told her about the announcement, about Mrs. Smile, about the whispers and the laughter and the certainty that she was about to become the biggest joke Westbrook Academy had ever seen. "She wants me to fail," said, her voice cracking. "She's doing this on purpose. She knows I'll embarrass myself in front of everyone. That's the whole point." Her grandmother was quiet for a long moment. She lifted her teacup, took a small sip, and set it back down. "What will you play?" she asked. Stared at her. "What?" "At the showcase, what piece will you perform?" I don't know, it doesn't matter. Whatever I play, I'll just prove her right. I'm not like those other students. I don't have their training. I've never performed in front of an audience like that. I'll freeze up or make mistakes or..." Her grandmother's voice was soft but firm. "Stop talking. What will you play?" Didn't have an answer. She had never thought about it. She had never allowed herself to imagine standing on a real stage, performing for a real audience. That dream had always belonged to someone else, someone with more money and more opportunities and a path that wasn't blocked at every turn. Her grandmother reached across the table and took hands. "Do you remember when you were 8 years old?" she asked. "You came home crying because the other children laughed at you for practicing piano during recess. You wanted to quit. Do you remember what I told you?" Nodded slowly. "You said that talent is a gift, but courage is a choice." "And what did you choose?" "To keep playing." Her grandmother smiled. "You've been making that choice every day since. Every night at that piano, every piece you've mastered, every hour you've spent when you could have been doing something easier." She squeezed hands. "You are more prepared than you know. The question is whether you believe it." Felt tears welling up again, but this time they were different. Not tears of defeat, something else. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. "You can," her grandmother said, "and I know exactly what you should play." She stood up slowly, walked to the piano and sat down on the bench. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a moment. Then she began to play. The music that filled the apartment was unlike anything else. It started soft and questioning, then built into something powerful and overwhelming. The notes crashed and swirled like a storm at sea. It was beautiful and terrifying and heartbreaking all at once. Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. Knew this piece. She had been learning it for 2 years, working on it in secret, never quite believing she would be ready to perform it. It was one of the most difficult piano pieces ever written. Professional pianists spent years mastering it. Conservatory students used it for their final examinations. And her grandmother wanted her to play it at the showcase. "This is impossible," said when the last note faded. "I'm not ready. I'll never be ready." Her grandmother turned to look at her. There was fire in her eyes, the same fire had seen the night she made her promise. "I taught you this piece for a reason," she said. "Not so you could play it in this apartment forever. Not so it could be your secret. I taught you because I knew this day would come. Maybe not like this. Maybe not so soon, but I knew." She patted the bench beside her. "You have 1 week," she said. "We will practice every night until your fingers memorize every note. And when you walk onto that stage, you will not play for misses. You will not play for those students who laughed at you. You will play for yourself, for me, for every person who was ever told they weren't good enough." Walked to the piano and sat down beside her grandmother. The keys looked different somehow, less frightening, more like old friends waiting to welcome her home. "What if I fail?" she asked quietly. Her grandmother put an arm around her shoulders. "Then you fail trying," she said, "and that is worth more than a lifetime of hiding." Took a deep breath. She placed her fingers on the keys. And she began to practice. Outside, the sun was setting over the city. Inside, the music played on, filling the tiny apartment with sound and fury and hope. 1 week, 7 days to prepare for the most important performance of her life. Mrs. wanted to make an example of her. Fine. Would give her one. The week that followed was the hardest of life. Every morning she woke up before dawn. She would sit at the piano in the gray light, practicing scales and arpeggios to warm up her fingers. Then she would play through the Chopin piece slowly, note by note, section by section, until it was time to leave for school. At Westbrook, things had gotten worse. Word had spread about her being chosen for the showcase. Students she had never spoken to would smirk at her in the hallways. A group of girls from the music class started calling her the charity case when they thought she couldn't hear. Someone left a note in her locker that said, "Good luck. You'll need it," with a little drawing of a piano on fire. Mrs. seemed to enjoy watching her squirm. In class, she would casually mention the showcase and then glance at with that knowing smile. She would talk about the important donors who would be attending, the college scouts in the audience, the television crew that filmed highlights every year. Each detail was another weight added to shoulders. But didn't let it break her. She had made a promise to her grandmother, and she intended to keep it. Every night after school, she would rush home and go straight to the piano. Her grandmother would sit in her chair nearby, listening and guiding. Sometimes they worked on technical passages, drilling the same few measures over and over until his hands moved without thinking. Other times, they focused on emotion, on bringing life to the music instead of just playing the correct notes. "Slower here," her grandmother would say. "Let the melody breathe. You're rushing because you're nervous. The audience will feel that. Make them wait. Make them lean forward." Or she would shake her head and stop mid-phrase. "You're holding back. This part is pain, real pain. You felt pain in your life. Use it. Pour it into the keys." By Wednesday's fingers were sore. By Thursday they were blistered. By Friday she could barely straighten them without wincing. But she kept playing. She played through the pain because she knew that pain was temporary. Failure would last much longer. On Saturday morning, the day of the showcase, woke up to silence. She lay in bed for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling. In 12 hours, she would be standing on a stage in front of hundreds of people. In 12 hours, she would either prove everyone wrong or confirm everything they believed about her. She had never been so terrified in her life. Her mother made her favorite breakfast that morning, though could barely eat. Her father, who had been working double shifts all week, had taken the day off to attend the showcase. He sat across from her at the tiny kitchen table and smiled. "Whatever happens tonight," he said, "we're proud of you. You know that, right?" Nodded, but the words barely registered. Her mind was already at the piano, already running through the piece, already imagining everything that could go wrong. Her grandmother didn't say much that day. She just sat in her chair by the window, watching the clouds drift by. But in the afternoon, a few hours before they had to leave, she called over. "Sit with me," she said. Sat on the floor beside her grandmother's chair, the way she used to when she was a little girl. "I want to tell you something," her grandmother said, "something I've never told anyone." Looked up at her. "When I was young, back in Shanghai, I was supposed to perform at a very important concert, the most important of my life. Critics were coming, scouts from orchestras in Europe. Everyone said this was my moment, my chance to become something great." She paused and her eyes grew distant. "The night before, I couldn't sleep. I was so afraid of failing, afraid of disappointing my family, afraid that everything I had worked for would disappear if I made one mistake." "What happened?" asked. Her grandmother smiled sadly. "I never got to perform. The war came. Everything changed. I had to leave the country, leave my home, leave my piano. By the time I reached America, that dream was gone forever." Felt her heart ache. She had never heard this story before. "I spent many years being angry," her grandmother continued. "Angry at the world for taking my chance away. But then I had your mother, and then I had you, and I realized something important." She reached down and touched his face gently. "The music didn't die. It just found a new home in you." Tears spilled down his cheeks. "Tonight you're not just playing for yourself," her grandmother said. "You're playing for both of us, for the concert I never got to give, for the dream that was stolen from me 60 years ago." She smiled, and her eyes were bright with tears of her own. "Don't be afraid. I'll be right there with you, every note." Hugged her grandmother tight. They stayed like that for a long time, 2 generations holding onto each other and the music that connected them. That evening, put on the only nice dress she owned. It was simple and black, something her mother had found at a thrift store and altered to fit. She didn't have jewelry or fancy shoes, but when she looked in the mirror, she saw someone different than the girl who had walked into Westbrook Academy all those months ago. She saw someone ready to fight. The auditorium was already filling up when they arrived. had never seen so many expensive cars in one place. Women in elegant dresses and men in tailored suits streamed through the entrance. She spotted news cameras near the stage and felt her stomach flip. Her family found seats in the back. The front rows were reserved for donors and board members, the people who mattered at Westbrook, but her grandmother squeezed her hand before she headed backstage. "Remember," she whispered, "play for us." Backstage was chaos. Students in formal attire rushed around, warming up on practice keyboards, adjusting their hair, whispering nervously to each other. Found a quiet corner and tried to make herself invisible. It didn't work. The girl whose father had donated the library wing walked over with two of her friends. She looked up and down, taking in the simple dress and the second-hand shoes. "Nice outfit," she said, not bothering to hide her smirk. "Very vintage." Her friends laughed. "I hope you're ready," the girl continued. "My mother said there's a scout here from the Manhattan Conservatory, like the best music school in the country. Not that it matters for you, obviously." Didn't respond. She just looked at the girl calmly, waiting. The girl seemed annoyed by the lack of reaction. "Whatever, good luck out there. You're going to need it." They walked away laughing, took a deep breath and closed her eyes. She thought about her grandmother, about the concert she never got to play, about 60 years of a dream deferred. Not tonight. The showcase began. One by one, students were called to the stage, listened from behind the curtain as they performed. Some were good, some were excellent. All of them received polite applause from the sophisticated audience. Mrs. served as the host, introducing each performer with glowing praise. She talked about their training, their accomplishments, their bright futures. Her voice was warm and proud, like a mother showing off her favorite children. Then there was only one performer left. "And now," Mrs. said, and could hear the shift in her tone, "we have a special performance. As some of you may know, Westbrook believes in giving opportunities to students from all backgrounds. Tonight, one of our scholarship students will take the stage. Let's give her our support." The applause was thin, scattered, almost pitying. Stepped out from behind the curtain. The stage lights were blinding. She couldn't see the audience, but she could feel them. Hundreds of eyes watching her, waiting for her to stumble. She heard whispers rippling through the crowd. She saw Mrs. standing to the side, arms crossed, that familiar smile on her face. The grand piano sat in the center of the stage, gleaming under the lights. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. Walked toward it. Her legs felt like they might give out at any moment. Her hands were shaking. Every step seemed to take forever. She reached the piano and sat down on the bench. The auditorium fell silent, not the respectful silence that had greeted the other performers. This was different. This was the silence of people waiting for a car crash. Looked out at the darkness where the audience sat. She couldn't see her family, but she knew they were there. Her mother, her father, her grandmother who had given up everything so that one day someone could finish what she had started. She placed her fingers on the keys. They were still trembling. She closed her eyes. She took one breath, then another. She thought about her grandmother's words, about playing for both of them, about the concert that was stolen 60 years ago. The trembling stopped. Opened her eyes. And she began to play. The first notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 floated into the silence like a question. Soft, gentle, almost fragile. The melody drifted through the auditorium, and for a moment nothing else existed. Just those simple, haunting notes hanging in the air like the first drops of rain before a storm. People in the audience shifted in their seats. This wasn't what they expected. They had come prepared to witness a disaster, to watch a scholarship girl stumble through some basic piece while Mrs. smiled knowingly from the side of the stage. But this sound, this was something different. Kept her eyes closed. She wasn't in the auditorium anymore. She was back in her grandmother's tiny apartment, sitting at the old upright piano with the scratched wood and the sticky keys. She could feel her grandmother beside her, guiding her hands, whispering instructions. "Slower here, let it breathe, make them wait." The melody began to build. What started as a whisper grew into something stronger, more confident. Fingers moved across the keys like they had a life of their own, finding notes she had practiced 1,000 times in the darkness of early mornings and late nights. In the audience, whispers stopped. Phones that had been secretly recording lowered to laps. People who had been checking their watches suddenly forgot about time altogether. Mrs. Smile began to fade. The piece moved into its first major passage and attacked it with everything she had. Her hands flew across the keyboard, striking chords that rang out like thunder. The technical difficulty was staggering. Runs and arpeggios that would challenge professional pianists poured from her fingers without hesitation. But it wasn't just the technique that stunned the audience. It was the emotion. Every note carried weight. Every phrase told a story. You could hear the struggle in the music, the pain, the longing for something just out of reach. It was the sound of a girl who had been told her whole life that she wasn't good enough, finally proving that she was. In the back row, mother grabbed her husband's hand. Tears were streaming down her face. She had heard her daughter practice this piece for months, but she had never heard her play it like this. Not with this fire, not with this heart. Beside her's grandmother sat perfectly still. Her eyes were fixed on the stage, on the small figure at the grand piano. And for the first time in 60 years, she was back in Shanghai. She was 22 years old again, about to play the concert of her dreams. Only this time, nothing would stop the music. On stage reached the emotional center of the piece. This was the part her grandmother had made her practice over and over, the part that required more than just skill. It required truth. She thought about everything that had led to this moment. The factory closing, the move to a city where they knew no one, the tiny apartment with thin walls and a clanking radiator. She thought about walking into Westbrook and feeling invisible, about Mrs. cold eyes and cruel questions, about every whisper and every laugh and every moment she had wanted to give up. She poured all of it into the keys. The music swelled into something massive and overwhelming. It crashed through the auditorium like waves against a cliff. People in the front row leaned back in their seats, physically moved by the sound. A woman in pearls put her hand over her heart. A man who had attended concerts at the finest halls in Europe sat with his mouth slightly open, unable to believe what he was hearing. And still played on. The piece built toward its thundering climax. Fingers struck the keys with fierce precision, drawing out sounds that seemed impossible from a single piano. The whole instrument seemed to shake with the force of the music. Years of practice, years of sacrifice, years of being told she didn't belong, all compressed into these few minutes of pure, unfiltered expression. Then, as quickly as it had risen, the storm began to fade. The music softened. The crashing waves retreated. What was left was something tender and broken, a melody that spoke of loss and acceptance and the quiet strength it takes to keep going when everything falls apart. Played the final passage with tears rolling down her cheeks. She didn't try to stop them. She let them fall onto her hands, onto the keys, becoming part of the music itself. This was what her grandmother had taught her. Music isn't about being perfect. It's about being real. The last note hung in the air, pure and clear and impossibly beautiful. Then silence. For what felt like an eternity, no one moved. No one breathed. The auditorium was frozen, suspended in the echo of what they had just witnessed. Then someone in the back row stood up. It was grandmother. She was struggling to her feet, one hand on her daughter's shoulder for support, the other pressed against her chest. She began to clap. One person, clapping alone in the silence. Then's parents stood, then the couple next to them, then a row near the middle, then another, and another. Within seconds, The entire auditorium was on its feet. The applause was deafening. It rolled through the hall like thunder, echoing off the walls and ceiling. People were cheering. Some were crying. A few shouted words that couldn't make out through the roar. She sat at the piano, stunned, unable to process what was happening. She looked out at the sea of standing people and couldn't believe they were clapping for her. The scholarship girl, the charity case, the one who wasn't supposed to belong. Off to the side of the stage, Mrs. stood frozen. Her face was pale. Her arms hung limply at her sides. She looked like someone who had just watched her entire worldview collapse in front of her eyes. She had wanted to make an example of. She had succeeded, just not the way she planned. Finally stood from the piano bench and took a small bow. The applause somehow grew even louder. She walked off stage on legs that didn't feel connected to her body, still not fully believing that any of this was real. Backstage, she was immediately surrounded by people. Students who had ignored her for months were suddenly shaking her hand and telling her how amazing she was. The girl who had mocked her dress just an hour ago couldn't meet her eyes. But pushed through all of them, she had somewhere else to be. She found her family waiting near the back exit. Her mother was crying too hard to speak. Her father just held her tight and didn't let go for a long time, but it was her grandmother who needed to see. The old woman was sitting on a bench, looking exhausted but happier than had ever seen her. "I did it," whispered kneeling beside her. "We did it." Her grandmother cupped face in her weathered hands. "You did more than that," she said softly. "You finished the concert I started 60 years ago." They held each other and cried. 2 generations, 1 dream, finally complete. Later that night, as the crowd was leaving, a woman in an elegant coat approached family. She was older, with kind eyes and an air of authority. She handed a business card. "I'm the head of admissions at the Manhattan Conservatory," she said. "I've been scouting talent for over 30 years, and I have to tell you, I've never seen anything quite like what you did tonight." Stared at the card, unable to speak. "We have a full scholarship program for exceptional students," the woman continued. "I'd like to discuss your future whenever you're ready." She smiled, nodded to family, and walked away into the night. Looked down at the card in her trembling hands. Manhattan Conservatory, full scholarship, her future. She thought about the months of humiliation, the cruel words and mocking laughter, the teacher who tried to break her spirit, and she realized something important. All of it had led to this moment. Mrs. had meant to embarrass her. Instead, she had given the stage she needed to change her life forever. Years later, when performed at concert halls around the world, interviewers would always ask about her journey. How did she get started? Who inspired her? What kept her going when things got hard? And every time, she told the same story. About a grandmother who carried a piano across an ocean. About a teacher who tried to tear her down. And about a night when a quiet girl from Ohio sat at a grand piano and showed the world what happens when someone underestimates the power of a dream. Some people are born with advantages, money, connections, doors that open before they even knock. But some people have something else, something that can't be bought or taught or handed down. They have heart. And heart, learned, is the one thing no one can ever take away.